friends, it's Carrie. Welcome back to my channel. Thanks for joining me. Today I wanted to do a wrap up and talk about the 4 books that I read this week. 2 were physical books and 2 were audiobooks. The first book that I read was Out of Darkness by Ashley Hope Perez, and this is a young adult historical fiction. And the centerpiece of this book is actually the worst school disaster in American history. And I was completely ignorant of this incident, so I was pretty shocked when I read this book. And it actually includes a picture of the rubble and the aftermath of that school explosion. Now, in Texas oil towns, it wasn't uncommon for residences and businesses to tap into the residue gas lines that these oil companies had. Now, it's free gas, which is definitely a perk, but it's not treated, and so it's colorless and odorless, and so if there is a gas leak, there's really no way to detect it. There's no telling how long this school had a gas leak and how long that gas was building up in the school. And so very emotional read, to say the least. And that's not the only horrific thing that happens in this book. We follow our main character Naomi, who is a Mexican girl living in this town with her stepfather Henry and her 2 siblings who are twins, Beto and Kari. Now, Beto and Kari, since Henry is their father and he's white, they're able to pass as white. Naomi has a difficult time fitting in with the students at her school who are mostly white, and she also is even turned away at the local grocer. So she doesn't fit into that world, and she also doesn't fit into the world of her boyfriend. She does meet and fall in love with a boy named Wash, and his father is the principal at the black school. And so she doesn't quite fit into his life either. It's a great story to explore all the different types of discrimination and prejudice that would have been present in a 1930s Texas oil town. I don't want to give too much away, but I will tell you that there are a lot of very graphic emotional scenes in this book, and so I do recommend it. I thought it was a wonderful book, but it is pretty heavy emotionally, so I wouldn't suggest it if you're looking for a lighthearted, uplifting read. The second book that I read this week was the Port Chicago 50 Disaster, Mutiny, and the Fight for Civil Rights by Steve Sheinkin. And the first 2 books I'm talking about this week have a major disaster in them. But this is a young adult nonfiction history book. And it definitely illuminates a little known piece of civil rights history that I was unaware of. So I really like how the books that I'm seeing are talking about very unique pieces of our history that most people are unaware of or know very little about. Now, the Port Chicago 50 definitely had a profound impact on our military policies with regards to segregation and discrimination of black troops. Just to give a little background, during World War II, black troops were relegated to segregated units where they would have a white officer in charge of them, and they were typically used in support roles. For the black soldiers, this was definitely a slap in the face because they wanted to serve their country and they wanted to fight. We do see throughout the book references to other incidents, and even one that involves Jackie Robinson, which is pretty neat to see that throughout the book. But the Port Chicago 50, these Navy men were at a port in California, and their job was to load bombs and ammunition onto ships. Now, as we look through this book, you see in the beginning there are concerns voiced pretty much from the start about the soldiers feeling resentment that only black troops are doing this job, and also that they really haven't been trained on safe handling of these bombs and ammunition. And so this leads to some pretty intense incidents, and eventually it leads to a massive explosion on the port that kills, I want to say, over 300 people. And eventually, once most of the troops have recovered from injuries, they are led down to the dock with the idea that they're going to continue to load ammunition and bombs, and they refuse to obey this order. They tell their officers they will do anything else, they will follow any other order, but they just do not feel safe handling these bombs and ammunition when there's been this massive explosion, and they don't really feel like they've been adequately trained to do this job. Now, of course, some of the white officers will try to make the argument that, you know, this job is no more or less dangerous than being out in combat. And of course, the argument there is in combat, you at least, you know, many times are able to fight back. With this, you know, you don't have that ability. 50 of these Navy men will be charged with mutiny, which carries a sentence of death. This becomes a pretty high-profile civil rights case that exposes a lot of bad practices within the military. Thurgood Marshall follows the case. So we see court transcripts, we see pictures of the Navy men, and a lot of excerpts from interviews with the Port Chicago 50. I don't want to give it away because, you know, it's a very interesting read, and I was shocked at how everything is handled in the end, because we definitely see up to this point the military is starting to explore with the idea of integration. And I really was heartened to see in this book that on those first attempts at integration, there really were no problems. All of the problems that people in high command anticipated really were non-issues. So it really gives you, you know, faith in the American people to come together and get the job done, especially in a time of crisis like World War II. This is a very interesting read. I'd highly recommend it, especially if you're like me and you really didn't know anything about this particular incident. I think it's definitely worth it, and it's fairly short. The third book that I read this week was an audiobook, and it was called The Wicked Sister by Dionne. And this is a psychological thriller. We follow this girl, Rachel, who at the beginning of the book is in a mental institution. And she's been in a mental institution for 15 years, since she was a child. And what prompted her to be sent to this mental institution is the fact that her parents were murdered. The official story is that it was a murder-suicide and that her father did it. But Rachel blames herself. She keeps having these visions of her standing over her mother with this gun. And so she is struggling internally with a lot of guilt and a lot of questions, because some of her memories aren't complete. There are gaps in her memory, and there are secrets that will be revealed throughout this book. There are 2 points of views in this book. So you get Rachel's point of view, but you also get her mother's point of view. And so we will see Jenny and her struggles raising two daughters, 2 very different daughters. And I don't want to give it away because, well, some of it is already given away in the title. I mean, it's called The Wicked Sister. So you kind of assume that Rachel's sister is evil. And yeah, she is. I will say this book had a little bit of Where the Crawdads Sing vibes for me, simply because the parents in this are biologists and naturalists. So there's a lot of discussion and talk about that, and about the different animals that they see and animals that they study. And Rachel is kind of a little bit of a survivalist. We'll see that she when her parents were murdered, she survived out in the woods by herself. This was a very interesting read. I enjoyed it. There were twists and turns, even though some of it is kind of given away in the title. I would definitely recommend it. The last book that I read this week was an audiobook, and it was called Rage Becomes Her: The Power of Women's Anger. And I will pop the book cover up here because I'm not sure how to pronounce the author's name, but I will say this was a very interesting read. I'm not one who enjoys anger. I don't enjoy confrontation. The author certainly has a bit of a rant in this book and also has a certain political perspective and opinion there. So if you're not interested in reading anything like that, then probably don't pick up this book. But I will say she brings up a lot of great points. This is really a discussion of how anger is treated in women and men from childhood on through adulthood. And one thing that really resonated with me is the fact that it appears women are more likely to ruminate on emotions like anger, and they don't really express that emotion very frequently or feel free to do that. And unfortunately, that tendency to ruminate also leads to lots of physical ailments. And so that was probably my favorite part of the book, was where she talks about the connection between suppressed anger and illness. And I think there is something to that for sure. I don't think any sort of unbridled anger or rage is beneficial for anyone. And she makes the argument in the book that anger is a more acceptable male emotion. And I do agree with that to a certain extent. I definitely saw a lot of what she was saying with regard to children and how, for little girls, sadness is seen as more of an acceptable emotion, whereas with boys, they are typically allowed to express their anger. And I also thought her discussion of pregnancy and motherhood was very interesting. She's been influenced by the feminine mystique for sure. For most of our history, women have had to justify their existence by having children, and that is a part of what makes you a female or what makes you worthy and a productive member of society. On the flip side of that discussion about motherhood and childbirth is the fact that most of society doesn't really allow for women to be angry about some of the challenges related to pregnancy and motherhood, and that if you're angry on behalf of your kids or on behalf of a family member, that's acceptable, but it's not really seen as acceptable to be angry just for yourself, just because you've been mistreated or discriminated against in a particular way. I was shocked to find out in this book that in the U.S. Capitol building, there was not a female bathroom for our legislators that was close to the chambers until a few years ago. And this was an issue when it came to voting, because women legislators would have to walk a crazy distance to find a bathroom, and many would have to race back just to make it to the vote, and some would even miss their votes. And I thought that was just unbelievable. I don't know, maybe I live in a bubble, but I thought that was just so bizarre. But of course, for most of our history, a female restroom near the, legislative house wasn't really needed. I thought this book was very thought-provoking, and there were several things that were brought out in this book that I didn't know about. So I do feel like I took something away from this book, but I think in general that whether it's coming from a female or male, just me personally, when it comes from a place of rage or anger, I typically tune it out. I don't really give power to that emotion in other people. So I had a pretty good reading week. I hope you guys did too. Please let me know in the comments if you've read any of these books, and I hope I will see you in my next video.